The pen was already on the paper. One signature and Clara Ashford would be gone from the Royal Guard forever. 6 men in scarlet uniforms had already made up their minds, and not a single one of them would look at her. But before that pen finished moving, a sound came through those old stone walls that stopped every heart in the room. And nothing was ever the same again. Let me take you back to where it all began. My amazing friends and family, welcome back to Jenna's Velvet Tales. Before we continue, please take a moment to subscribe. Every subscription helps us share more emotional stories. If this kind of story touches you, your support truly means a lot. Feel free to say where you're watching from, and don't forget to explore more beautiful stories here on the channel. Now back to the story. Clara stood at the far end of a long, dark wooden table in a room made of stone. The walls were rough and old, the ceiling was high, and the only real light came from above, falling down on the table like a spotlight on a stage where she was not welcome. She was 23 years old. Her dark brown hair was pulled back tight. Her navy blue uniform was buttoned all the way up to her chin, pressed so neatly you could see the effort she put into every single crease. She wore white gloves, and inside those gloves, her fingers were trembling. But she kept her hands clasped behind her back because she had learned a long time ago how to shake where nobody could see. 6 men sat around that polished table, and every one of them was old enough to be her grandfather. They wore scarlet-red uniforms covered in gold trim, with heavy medals pinned across their chests and thick gold braiding on their shoulders. White mustaches, white hair, white gloves folded over crossed arms, and not one pair of eyes pointed in her direction. General Hargrove sat right at the center. He was 71 years old, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the same stone as the walls around him. His mustache was perfectly white and perfectly trimmed, and his hands were rough and thick from 4 decades of military life. He held a file open in front of him, and he was reading from it the way someone reads a phone bill. Flat, bored, like the words didn't matter at all. "Corporal Ashford's placement has been reviewed by the board," he said, and his voice echoed slightly off the stone. "Her transfer to this unit was the result of a processing error. She does not meet the required physical threshold. She has insufficient field experience. And her continued presence has resulted in 3 formal complaints from senior personnel." Clara felt every word land in her chest like a small, cold stone dropping into water. Processing error. That's what they called her. Not a person who had trained for 14 months. Not a woman who had scrubbed floors before dawn and volunteered for every shift nobody else wanted. Processing error. A mistake on paper that needed to be corrected. Colonel Mercer sat to Hargrove's left. He was the kind of man who always cleared his throat before he said something unkind, as if that little cough somehow made cruelty more polite. He adjusted his glasses and leaned forward slightly. "I'd recommend the removal be processed today, sir," Mercer said, and he said it to Hargrove, not to Clara, because in his mind she was already gone. Quietly. No need for it to become a story. Quietly. That word hit Clara somewhere so deep she almost lost her footing. They didn't just want her gone. They wanted her gone without a sound. Like she had never walked through the gate, never put on this uniform, never spent 14 months trying to prove she belonged in a place where every wall and every face told her she didn't. Hargrove uncapped his pen. He placed the tip against the bottom of the page, right on the signature line. And Clara watched from the far end of that long table, standing perfectly still, barely breathing, because she knew that if she blinked, her eyes would fill. And if they filled, these men would see exactly what they expected to see. A young woman who couldn't handle it. A girl who never should have been here in the first place. So she didn't blink. She stood the way her mother had taught her to stand when the world felt too heavy and too loud. Her mother's name was Ruth. She had been a small woman with strong hands and a soft voice, and she had spent her life cleaning other people's houses to pay the rent on a tiny flat in Bristol that always smelled like dog food and lavender hand cream, because Ruth Ashford rescued dogs. Not as a job and not for money, but because it was who she was. Old dogs, sick dogs, dogs that had been left on the side of the road or tied to fences outside shops and never collected. Their little flat had never held fewer than 4 dogs at one time, sometimes 5, and the kitchen floor was always covered in blankets and bowls and chew toys that had been loved down to nothing. Clara grew up on that floor. She learned to read a dog's body before she learned to read words on a page. She knew what a tucked tail meant and what a low whine sounded for, and what it looked like when a dog who had been abandoned finally understood that someone was going to stay. Her mother would sit with the new ones on the kitchen floor at midnight, no matter how tired she was, stroking their ears and whispering the same thing every time. "You're home now. You're safe. Nobody's sending you away." Ruth had gotten sick 4 years ago. Cancer. The kind that moves slowly, which sounds like it should be better but isn't, because slow means you watch. Slow means you sit in a plastic chair beside a hospital bed night after night, holding a hand that gets thinner every week, telling stories about the dogs at home and what funny things they did that morning, pretending everything is normal while the machines beep and the nurses come and go and the woman who raised you disappears one breath at a time. Clara had held her mother's hand for 19 straight hours at the end. She talked the whole time, because a nurse had told her that hearing is the last thing to leave, and Clara could not bear the thought of her mother going in silence. She talked about the dogs. She talked about the weather. She talked about a man on the bus who had been wearing 2 different shoes and hadn't seemed to notice. She talked until her voice cracked, and then she kept going, because as long as she was talking, her mother was still there to listen. And then Ruth stopped breathing, and the room went quiet, and Clara was alone in a way she had never been alone before. After the funeral, after the last of the neighbors had dropped off casseroles and patted her shoulder and said, "She's in a better place," in that voice people use when they don't know what else to say, Clara sat in the empty flat with 3 old rescue dogs at her feet and no idea what to do next. No family left. No plan. No reason to set an alarm for the morning. She found the letter 2 days later. It was folded inside her mother's Bible, tucked between the pages of Psalms, and the paper was so soft and worn that Clara knew it had been opened and refolded many, many times, as if Ruth had read her own words back to herself over and over again, working up the courage to mean them. "My sweet girl, you were made for something bigger than this small life I gave you. Don't be afraid of rooms full of people who don't believe in you. Walk in anyway." Clara had sat on her mother's bed and read that letter 7 times. She held it against her chest and cried into the pillow that still smelled like lavender. And then she got up, washed her face, and applied to the Royal Guard the next morning. Not because she felt brave. She didn't feel brave at all. She felt terrified and empty and completely lost. But her mother had asked her to walk into scary rooms, and doing what her mother asked was the closest thing to having her mother still alive. So she walked. And now, 14 months later, she stood in the scariest room she had ever entered, and the man at the center of the table was about to sign her out of it forever. Hargrove's pen moved across the line. Slowly, carefully, the way you sign something when you've already decided it doesn't matter. Clara watched the ink trail behind the tip and felt her future shrinking with every millimeter. And she thought of her mother's letter and wondered if Ruth had ever imagined that the room her daughter walked into would be this cold, this quiet, this final. And then the sound came. It didn't start with an alarm. It didn't start with a shout or a crash or anything Clara expected. It started with a single bark, sharp and high, echoing from somewhere deep inside the stone corridors beyond the chamber. Then another bark, and then a howl that rose up through the walls and filled the room like water filling a bowl. Long and broken and raw and desperate. Every man at that table stopped moving. Clara's whole body went tight, because she knew that sound. She had heard it 100 times on her mother's kitchen floor. That was not an angry dog. That was not a dog being aggressive or territorial or playful. That was a dog in pain. That was a dog crying for help. That was the sound an animal makes when it is alone and afraid and doesn't understand why the world has suddenly gone dark. Hargrove's pen lifted from the page. He looked toward the door. Mercer turned in his chair. Captain Aldridge, the younger officer standing near the back wall. Early 30s, reddish-brown hair, the only man in the room who had looked at Clara even once during the proceedings, took a step forward. And then the chamber door swung open, and Sergeant Briggs came through it fast. He was a big man with broad shoulders and a square jaw, and right now his face was the color of old paper. White and tight and barely holding together. "Sir," Briggs said. and his voice was the voice of a man trying very hard to sound professional while something terrible pulled at every word. The North Passage. The old scaffolding along the east wall. It's come down, sir. The whole section. Hargrove set his pen down. Injuries. Chaplain Beckett's granddaughter was walking through the passage with her dog, sir. We got the child out. She's frightened. She's got some scrapes, but she's safe. Briggs paused, swallowed. But the dog went back in. Went back in. Hargrove frowned. The girl dropped something during the first collapse, sir. A scarf. Her mother's scarf. The dog pulled free from the guard holding him and ran back into the passage to get it. And then the second section came down. He's trapped in there. We can hear him, but we can't get to him. The debris is packed too tight, too unstable. Every time someone tries to move a piece, more falls. Patterson tried to crawl in about 10 minutes ago and nearly got buried himself. The room went very still. The kind of still where you can hear people breathing and you wish you couldn't, because the silence means nobody knows what to do. Hargrove rubbed the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers. He looked tired. Not just tonight tired. Decades tired. The kind of tired that comes from making hard decisions in rooms like this one for 40 years. How far in is the animal? He asked. 30, maybe 40 feet, sir. Deep in the passage, near where it connects to the old chapel wing. And the engineering response? 45 minutes at best. Could be longer. Hargrove closed his eyes for just a moment. And when he opened them, his voice was steady and flat and final. Then we wait for the engineering team. Seal the corridor. No one else goes in. Briggs stood there for a second too long, and Clara could see it on his face. The thing he wanted to say but couldn't, because he was a sergeant and Hargrove was a general, and in this world that gap is wider than any collapsed corridor. Sir, Briggs said carefully, we reached a veterinary officer by phone. He said that a dog in that condition, with that level of distress and possible crush injuries, has maybe 20 minutes before the shock. I heard you, Sergeant. The words came out sharp, and Briggs closed his mouth and nodded once and stood at attention, and the matter was closed. Sealed up and put away, just like Clara's career, just like everything in this room, decided by men at a table who believed that authority was the same thing as being right. And then Clara heard something that broke her open. It came from just outside the chamber door. Not the dog this time. Something smaller. A child's voice, thin and shaking. The kind of crying that comes from so deep inside a little body that the words can barely find their way out. Please, please, he went back for Mummy's scarf. Please don't leave him in there. He went back because I dropped it. It's my fault. Please, he's all I have left of her. Please. Clara turned her head toward the door, and through the gap she could see her. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, sitting on the cold stone floor of the corridor with her knees pulled up to her chest. She had brown hair that was messy and full of dust, and her face was red and swollen from crying, and she was wearing a green coat that was at least 3 sizes too big for her, the sleeves hanging past her hands, and Clara knew instantly that coat had belonged to someone bigger, someone who used to wrap this child up in it, someone who wasn't here anymore. A guard stood near the girl looking helpless, the way grown men look when a child is falling apart in front of them, and they realize that rank and training and 40 years of service don't teach you what to say to a 6-year-old whose heart is breaking. Clara's hands stopped trembling, just like that, as if someone had reached inside her chest and steadied something that had been shaking for 4 years. Because she knew this child. Not her name, not her face, but her. She knew what it was like to sit on a cold floor and beg the world to stop taking things away. She knew what it was like to hold onto the last piece of someone you loved and feel it slipping through your fingers. She knew what it sounded like when a little girl says, please, and means, I can't lose anything else. And she knew, with a certainty that went deeper than training or protocol or anything she had ever been taught in 14 months of service, that she could not stand in this room and listen to that child cry while a dog died alone in the dark 30 feet away because a man at a table decided it wasn't worth the risk. Her mother's voice came back to her, clear as morning, steady as always. You help the ones who can't help themselves, Clara. That's what we do. That's what we've always done. Clara looked at General Hargrove. He was staring at his papers, jaw tight, pen resting beside the unfinished signature, and she could see something moving behind his eyes that he would never admit to. He could hear that child too. Every man in this room could hear her. And every man in this room was sitting still, because sitting still was safer than being wrong. "Sir," Clara said. The word came out rough and strange in the silence, and every head at the table turned toward her, because she had not spoken a single word during the entire proceedings. Not one. She had stood there and taken everything they said about her without opening her mouth. And now, for the first time that evening, these men actually looked at her face. "Permission to enter the North Passage, sir." Hargrove stared at her. For a long second he just stared, as if he couldn't quite process the fact that the woman he was dismissing had just made a request. "Denied," he said. "Sir, I have experience with structural collapse. My uncle ran a volunteer rescue crew in the Welsh mining villages. I trained with him every summer from the time I was 12. I know how to read debris. I know how to move through tight spaces without shifting the load above. And I'm small enough to fit through gaps that Sergeant Patterson couldn't. You are a corporal who is currently being processed for dismissal," Hargrove said, and his voice was harder now, not because he was angry but because she was making this difficult. "You have no authority to make operational requests." "That dog is dying, sir." The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was not the polite silence of agreement or the professional silence of procedure. It was the sharp, stunned silence that fills a room when someone has just crossed a line that everyone else was too afraid to touch. Because a corporal does not interrupt a general. Ever. Not in this uniform. Not in this building. Not in front of 6 senior officers at a formal review. But Clara held his gaze, and her eyes were bright. Not with tears, not anymore, but with something harder and clearer. "There is a little girl outside that door," Clara said, and her voice was steady now in a way it hadn't been steady in years, maybe ever. "She already lost her mother. I don't know when and I don't know how, but I know what that looks like because I've been her. That dog went back into a collapsing building to bring her the last thing that still smells like the person she lost. And right now, that dog is lying in the dark, alone, hurt, wondering why no one is coming for him." She paused, and then she said the truest thing she had ever said in her life. "I know what it feels like to lose everything, sir, and I will not stand in this room and let it happen to that child." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The clock on the far wall ticked and ticked and ticked. Hargrove looked at her. 10 seconds. 15. His jaw worked slowly, the way it does when a man is fighting with himself and both sides are losing. "If you get hurt in there," he said quietly, "it goes on my record." "Yes, sir. If you make it worse, if you cause a further collapse, that goes on my record too." "Yes, sir." He looked at her for one more long moment. Then he looked at the dismissal papers on the table. Then back at her. "Go," he said, and Clara walked out of that chamber, past 6 men in scarlet who had just watched the woman they were erasing walk toward the one thing none of them were willing to face. Captain Aldridge, standing by the door, shifted to the side as she passed. He didn't move out of the way because he was ordered to. He moved because something in her eyes told him she was right and everyone else in this room was wrong. And years later, when people asked him about that night, he would say he knew it in that moment. He knew they had almost made the worst mistake the Royal Guard had ever made. The North Passage was on the other side of the building, down 2 corridors and through a heavy wooden door that was usually kept open but tonight stood crooked on its hinges from the force of the collapse. Clara could smell the dust before she saw it. Thick and chalky, the kind that coats the inside of your mouth and turns your spit to paste. When she came through the door, the passage stretched ahead of her like something out of a bad dream. Stone everywhere. Broken pieces of wall scattered across the floor like teeth knocked loose. Timber from the scaffolding lay at angles, some pieces still attached to the wall by a single bolt, hanging there as if deciding whether to fall. Iron bars twisted and bent, poking out from the rubble like bones from a wound. And dust, so much dust, hanging in the lantern light and turning everything into a soft, orange blur. Sergeant Briggs was standing at the edge of the debris field with 3 other guards. His forehead was cut and his hands were shaking slightly, and when he saw Clara coming toward him in her undershirt, having already pulled off her tunic and belt and gloves somewhere in the corridor behind her. He opened his mouth to say something and then closed it again, because there was nothing to say that she didn't already know. She could hear the dog. Faint. So faint. A thin, high whine that came and went like a radio signal drifting in and out of range. He was still alive. But barely. And barely doesn't last. Clara knelt at the edge of the debris and pressed her bare hands against the stone. She felt the surface with her fingertips the way her Uncle Thomas had taught her in the summers spent pulling collapsed timbers off trapped miners. "Your eyes will lie to you underground, girl," he used to say, rolling a cigarette with one hand while pointing at a rock face with the other. "Your hands won't. If the stone is sweating, it's moving. If it's dry and warm, it's holding weight. Trust your skin." The stone was dry, holding, for now. She studied the pattern of the fall. The main scaffold frame had come down diagonally, leaning against the east wall, creating a narrow triangular space underneath. That space was the only reason the passage wasn't completely blocked. She could see a gap along the base of the wall, maybe 18 inches wide, maybe less. A person could crawl through it if that person was small enough and slow enough and willing to accept that the ceiling above was being held up by nothing more than angles and luck. "Corporal, you can't go in there," Briggs said. His voice was tight. Patterson tried and nearly brought the whole thing down. One wrong move and the frame shifts, and if the frame shifts— "I know," Clara said, and she got down on her stomach and pulled herself into the gap. The world shrank. Stone above her. Stone below her. Stone on both sides, pressing against her shoulders as she dragged herself forward on her forearms. Inch by inch, feeling every edge and every crack with her bare fingers. The scaffold frame groaned above her, a deep wooden sound that she felt in her teeth, and dust fell in thin streams with every vibration, getting into her eyes, her nose, her mouth. She breathed through her teeth, slow and steady, the way you breathe when fear is sitting right behind your ribs and the only thing keeping it from taking over is the rhythm of your own lungs. "Hey, boy!" she called softly into the darkness ahead. "Hey, sweet boy, I'm coming. You just hold on for me." Nothing. No bark. No whine. No sound at all except the groaning of timber and the scrape of her own body against stone. She crawled further. The passage narrowed. The gap shrank until she could feel stone pressing against her spine and stone pressing against her chest at the same time, and for one terrible, airless moment she could not move in any direction. She was stuck, wedged between layers of rock and wood in the dark, 30 feet from the entrance, with a collapsing structure above her and no room to turn around. Panic rose in her throat like something alive. Her heart slammed against the stone beneath her. Her vision blurred. Her muscles locked. And then her uncle's voice came to her, calm and rough and real, the way it always sounded on those summer mornings in the Welsh valleys when he would stand at the mouth of a collapsed shaft and look at it the way other men look at a crossword puzzle. "When the space won't let you through, don't fight it, girl. Exhale. Let everything out. Make yourself as small as you can. And then slide." Clara closed her eyes. She breathed out until her lungs were completely empty. Her ribs pulled inward. Her body compressed by just enough, just barely enough, and she slid forward 6 inches, then 8, and the space opened up slightly into a small pocket where the scaffold frame leaned against the old wall at an angle. And there he was, a golden retriever, lying on his side in the dust. His fur so covered in gray powder that he looked like a ghost. Maybe 4 years old, maybe 5. His eyes were half open and glassy, and his breathing came in quick, shallow pulls that made his whole body tremble with each one. A heavy timber beam lay across his back legs, not crushing them but holding them down, pinning him flat against the cold stone. And between his teeth, held gently, so gently, the way you hold something precious that you're afraid might break, was a pale blue scarf. Clara's vision blurred, and this time she let it. Nobody was watching down here. Nobody was judging or evaluating or writing reports. It was just her and a dog in the dark, and she could cry if she needed to, and she needed to because she understood now why he had gone back. He hadn't gone back because he was trained to fetch. He hadn't gone back because someone told him to. He had gone back because that scarf smelled like someone. Someone who used to hold the little girl who was crying upstairs. Someone who used to wrap that scarf around her neck on cold mornings and kiss the top of her head and say, "I love you," in all the small ways mothers say it. In packed lunches and bedtime stories and the way she always knew when something was wrong before you said a word. That dog didn't understand death. He didn't understand why that person stopped coming home. He just knew her scent, and he knew that when the little girl cried at night, the scarf with that scent was the thing that made the crying stop. So when the scarf fell, he went back for it. Because that's what love does. It doesn't think about risk or calculate the odds or wait for permission. It just goes back. "Oh, sweetheart," Clara whispered, and her voice broke on the word. "You brave, beautiful, stubborn boy. You held on." His tail moved. One small, weak thump against the stone floor. Just one. And that single movement nearly destroyed Clara, because it meant he had been lying here in the dark, hurt and scared and alone. And the sound of a kind voice was still enough to make him wag his tail. After everything, after the collapse and the pain and the silence and the waiting, he still had enough left inside him to say, in the only language he knew, "I'm here. I'm still here. Please don't leave me." Clara placed her hands on the timber beam across his legs. She felt the weight of it. She felt the angle, the pressure points, the way it connected to the larger frame above. If she moved it wrong, if she shifted it too fast or too far, the whole frame would adjust and everything above them would come down. She found a broken piece of wood nearby, thick enough to use as a lever, and she wedged it beneath the beam. Her arms shook. Her fingers, already torn and bleeding from the crawl, left red smears on the wood. She pressed down slowly, so slowly, 1 inch of lift, then 2. The dog whimpered. A soft, trusting sound that said, "It hurts, but I believe you." "I know, baby," Clara whispered. "I know it hurts. Almost there. Almost there." 3 inches. His legs slid free. He tried to stand and his back end gave out immediately, and Clara caught him, pulled him against her chest, felt his heart hammering against hers through fur and skin and bone. 30 kilos of trembling, dusty, golden dog pressing into her like she was the only solid thing left in the world. And he did not drop the scarf. Even now. Even in pain, even in the dark, even after everything. His jaw held that pale blue cloth with a gentleness that made Clara's chest ache in a way she hadn't felt since the night her mother stopped breathing. Because she recognized it. That holding on. That refusal to let go of the thing that carries someone you love. She had done it herself, hadn't she? She had carried her mother's letter inside her uniform, pressed against her heart, every single day for 14 months. She had held on to it the way this dog was holding on to this scarf. Not because it could bring her mother back, but because letting go felt like losing her all over again. Clara held him the way her mother used to hold the rescue dogs. The ones who came in shaking. The ones who had been left behind. She pressed her face into his dusty fur and whispered the words she had heard Ruth say 100 times on the kitchen floor at midnight. "You're not alone anymore. I've got you. And I'm not letting go." And now she had to get him out. The crawl back was the hardest thing Clara had ever done. She moved backward through the gap, one arm pulling her along, the other wrapped around the dog's body, guiding him through the narrow space while the whole structure complained above them. Every movement sent vibrations through the debris, and every vibration brought another shower of dust and grit and small stones that peppered her face and got into her wounds and stung so badly she had to bite down on the inside of her cheek to keep from crying out. Halfway through, the scaffold frame above shifted. Not a small creak. A deep, grinding sound like a ship breaking apart. Dust cascaded down in a thick wave that blinded her completely, and she felt the stone above her back press lower, closer, and for 3 seconds that felt like 3 years she was sure it was all coming down. She curled her body around the dog, covered him with her arms and her chest and everything she had. If it came down, it would hit her first. That was the only thought in her mind. Not bravery, not heroism, just the simple, animal certainty that she would not let this dog die alone in the dark. Not while she was breathing. Not while she could put herself between him and the weight of the world. The frame settled. The stone held. Clara opened her eyes and blinked through the dust and realized she was still alive and so was he, and she started moving again, pulling, dragging, sliding backward through that gap with her shoulders screaming and her hands slipping on the stone from her own blood. The last 10 feet took forever. Every inch was a negotiation with gravity and fear and the ancient, crumbling bones of a building that had been standing for 400 years and was now deciding whether tonight was the night it gave up. And then light, orange lantern light from the corridor entrance, falling across her face like warm water. Briggs was there, reaching for her, grabbing her arm, pulling her free, and she came out onto the corridor floor gasping and shaking and covered in blood and dust. The dog still cradled against her chest, the scarf still in his mouth. 3 seconds after Clara's feet cleared the gap, the scaffold frame gave way. The void collapsed behind her with a crash that shook the walls and sent a cloud of dust billowing out of the passage like smoke. Stone and timber crashed into the space where the dog had been lying, filling it completely, sealing it shut. 3 seconds. That was the margin between life and everything else. Briggs stared at the sealed passage. Then he looked at Clara, sitting on the floor, bleeding, holding a dog, alive by a margin so thin you could cut yourself on it. And then Clara heard running. Small feet on stone. Fast and desperate and uneven the way a child runs when they're not thinking about running, just moving toward the thing they need most. Maggie. She came around the corner in her too big green coat, sleeves flapping, face still streaked with tears and dust, and she stopped so suddenly she almost fell. Her eyes found the dog. Her mouth opened. No sound came out. She just stood there, looking at him, as if she was afraid that if she blinked, he would disappear. The dog lifted his head from Clara's chest. He saw the girl, and despite the pain, despite the shaking, despite his back legs not working properly and his body covered in dust, he pulled himself out of Clara's arms and dragged himself across the cold stone floor toward Maggie. He reached her. He put his head in her lap. And then, gently, with a tenderness that Clara would remember for the rest of her life, he opened his mouth and let the scarf fall into the girl's hands. Maggie picked it up. She held it against her face with both hands. She closed her eyes, and she breathed in, long and slow, searching for something in the threads of that old blue cloth. A smell, a memory, a trace of the person who used to wear it. Perfume, maybe, or laundry soap, or just the ghost of warmth that comes from being held by someone who loved you more than anything in the world. Whatever she found there, it broke her completely open. She wrapped both arms around the dog's neck and pressed her face into his fur and cried the way children cry when they have been holding it in for so long that their whole body shakes when it finally comes out. And the dog closed his eyes and leaned into her and pressed as close as he could, and the two of them sat on that cold stone floor, in the dust and the dim light, holding on to each other and onto the memory of a woman they had both lost. Clara sat 3 feet away. Her hands were bleeding. Her shoulders were raw. Her undershirt was torn across the back. She was covered in dust and dog hair and tears, and she pressed her palm against her mouth because the sound building inside her was 4 years deep, and if she let it out, it would never stop. She watched this little girl hold her dog and her dead mother's scarf, and she saw herself. She saw the hospital room and the plastic chair and the 19 hours and the moment the breathing stopped and the terrible, echoing quiet that came after. She saw the empty flat and the old rescue dogs sleeping at her feet and the letter in the Bible and the night she decided to walk into a room where nobody wanted her because her mother had asked her to and she had nothing else left to give except obedience to a dead woman's wish. And she understood, sitting there on the cold floor, bleeding and shaking and watching a child and a dog cling to each other in the ruins, that this was what her mother had meant. This was the something bigger. Not the uniform, not the rank, not the approval of 6 men at a polished table. The willingness to go into the dark when someone needed her. The refusal to sit still when a small voice said, "Please." Clara did not know that General Hargrove was standing behind her. She did not know that every officer had left the council chamber and followed the sound of the collapse to the corridor entrance. She did not know that Colonel Mercer had removed his glasses and was pressing his thumb and forefinger hard against the bridge of his nose, his lips pressed into a thin line. She did not know that Captain Aldridge, standing at the back, had tears running down his face and was making no effort at all to wipe them away. She only knew when she heard his voice. "Corporal." One word. Quiet. And something in the way he said it was entirely different from every other time he had spoken to her that night. Clara turned around. And what she saw in General Hargrove's face. But that is where we must pause. Because what happened next in that corridor, what Hargrove did with those dismissal papers, and what a 6-year-old girl said to him that changed the course of Clara Ashford's entire life, that is a moment that deserves its own telling. Clara turned around, and General Hargrove was standing 5 feet behind her. His scarlet uniform was still perfect. Every medal in place. Every button polished. His white gloves were still clean, his mustache still trimmed, his posture still straight as a flagpole. He looked exactly like a man who had spent 40 years building himself into something unbreakable. But his eyes were wet. Not crying. Not yet. But wet in the way that happens when something gets past the wall you've spent your whole life building, and you can feel it cracking from the inside, and you know that if you speak too quickly or breathe too hard, the whole thing is going to come down. He was holding 2 pieces of paper. Clara recognized them immediately. The dismissal forms. Her name at the top. Her service number. The signature line at the bottom where his pen had been resting when the sound of a dog crying had interrupted the end of her career. Hargrove looked at Clara. He looked at the little girl on the floor, still holding her dog, still breathing into her mother's scarf. He looked at the sealed passage behind them, the place where 3 seconds earlier there had been a space just big enough for a woman and a dog, now filled with stone and timber and silence. And then he tore the papers. Slowly. Not in anger, not in a rush, but deliberately, the way you do something when you want to feel every second of it. He tore them once down the center. Then he folded the halves together and tore them again. And he let the pieces fall from his fingers, and they drifted down to the stone floor and landed in the dust beside Clara's bloody hands and the dog's golden fur and the torn edge of a pale blue scarf. "Your record is cleared," Hargrove said. His voice cracked on the last word, and he paused, and he let it crack, and he did not try to cover it up or push past it. He just stood there and let the crack be heard by every officer behind him. "Your position in this unit is confirmed. Effective immediately. And permanently." Clara stared at him. She was sitting on the floor. Her hands were bleeding. Her undershirt was torn. She had dust in her hair and cuts on her shoulders and dog hair stuck to her skin with sweat and tears. And she looked nothing like a Royal Guard corporal and everything like a woman who had just crawled through the dark to keep a promise she never actually made out loud. "Sir," she started. But she didn't know what came after that, because nothing in her training had prepared her for this moment. Nothing in her life had prepared her for this moment. She had walked into this building tonight expecting to be erased, and instead she was sitting in the ruins of a collapsed passage with a rescued dog and a grieving child and a general who was looking at her the way no one had looked at her since her mother died. Like she mattered. Hargrove took 1 step closer. His boots crunched on the debris. Behind him, Clara could see the other officers standing in a loose half-circle at the corridor entrance. Colonel Mercer had his glasses in one hand and was pinching the bridge of his nose with the other. His mouth set in a hard line that could have been anger or shame or something too complicated for either word. 2 of the older officers stood with their arms at their sides, looking at the floor. Captain Aldridge was still at the back, tears still on his face, still not wiping them, watching Clara with an expression she couldn't quite read but that felt like recognition. Like he was seeing something he had been looking for without knowing it. "You said something in that chamber," Hargrove said, and his voice was low now, rough, stripped of all the authority and polish and military formality that usually coated every word like lacquer. This was just a man talking, an old man who had just watched something that cut through 40 years of doing things the proper way. "You said that dog was in the dark, alone, wondering why no one was coming." He stopped. His jaw moved the way jaws move when you're trying to hold something back that wants very badly to come out. "I have been in the Royal Guard for 40 years, he said, "and I have never been more ashamed of an order I gave than the one I gave tonight." The corridor was quiet. Not the cold, procedural quiet of the council chamber. Something different. Something raw. The kind of quiet that comes after something true has been said and everyone in the room knows it and no one wants to be the first to speak because the truth is still settling, still finding its shape, still pressing against the inside of everyone's chest like something that needed to be let in a long time ago. Hargrove looked at Maggie. The girl was still on the floor, her arms around the dog's neck, her face buried in his fur, the scarf clutched in one hand. She had stopped sobbing. Now she was just breathing. Slow, shaky breaths. The kind that come after a storm has passed through a small body and left everything wrung out and empty and strangely peaceful. "We were ready to dismiss you because you didn't fit what we expected," Hargrove said, turning back to Clara. "Because your scores weren't high enough. Because your field hours weren't long enough. Because 3 men who have never crawled through anything more dangerous than paperwork filed complaints about your presence." He paused. "And while we sat in that room deciding you weren't good enough, you were the only person in this entire building willing to go into the dark for a dog and a child." He straightened, his shoulders squared, his chin lifted. The general came back into his posture, but something underneath it had shifted permanently, like a bone that's been reset after years of sitting wrong. "That is the only thing that has ever mattered in this uniform," he said. "Not scores, not field hours, not the approval of men who are comfortable. The willingness to move when no one else will. You have that. You've had it since you walked through our gate. And we almost threw it away because we were too blind to see what was standing right in front of us." He took a breath, held it, let it go. "Welcome to the Royal Guard, Corporal Ashford." Clara opened her mouth and nothing came out. She sat there on the cold stone floor with her bleeding hands and her torn shirt and a golden retriever sleeping against a child 3 feet away, and she felt something happen inside her chest that she had no word for. It wasn't happiness, exactly. It wasn't relief. It was more like a door opening in a room that had been locked for so long she had forgotten it was there. A room where her mother's voice still lived. Where the letter still meant what it meant. Where the words "walk in anyway" finally, after all this time, made sense. She didn't cry. She had done enough crying for one night. She just nodded. Once. And Hargrove nodded back. And that was enough. Sometimes a nod between 2 people says more than 100 words ever could. Because it means I see you and I was wrong and you belong here all at the same time, and neither person needs to explain which one they mean because they both already know. And then Maggie looked up. She lifted her head from the dog's fur and turned toward Hargrove, and her face was small and streaked with dust and tears, and her eyes were red, and her voice was barely above a whisper. But it carried. In that stone corridor, with its old walls and high ceiling and perfect acoustics built for carrying the commands of generals, the voice of a 6-year-old girl carried like a bell. "She brought him back," Maggie said. 3 words. A child's voice. And they landed in that corridor with more weight than anything that had been said in the council chamber all night. Because a child doesn't calculate. A child doesn't measure words or weigh consequences or consider how something will look in a report. A child just says what is true. And what was true was that Clara had gone into the dark and brought him back, and Maggie wanted everyone standing there to know it. Mercer put his glasses back on. He didn't say anything. He just put them on and adjusted them and looked at Clara for a long moment, and then he turned and walked back toward the council chamber without a word. But Clara saw his hand, the one at his side where he thought no one was looking, and it was shaking. Not much, just a little, just enough. The other officers followed one by one. Some of them glanced at Clara as they passed. Some of them looked at Maggie and the dog. None of them said anything, but the silence they left behind was different from the silence they had carried into the corridor. It was lighter, like something heavy had been set down and everyone could feel the floor adjusting. Aldridge was the last to leave. He stopped beside Clara, and for a moment he just stood there, looking down at her with his hands at his sides and his scarlet uniform dusty at the knees where he had knelt at the corridor entrance without realizing it. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I stepped aside on purpose." Clara looked up at him. "I know," she said. He nodded. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a clean handkerchief, white with a small blue border, and he handed it to her without another word and walked away. Clara looked at the handkerchief in her bloody hand for a long moment, and then she pressed it against the worst cut on her right palm and held it there and felt the sting of clean cloth on open skin and thought, strangely, that it was the kindest thing anyone had done for her in a very long time. Briggs helped her up. He took her arm and lifted her to her feet as if she weighed nothing, and when she swayed slightly, He steadied her without comment and kept his hand on her elbow until she found her balance. "The vet is on his way for the dog," Briggs said. "Should be here in 10 minutes. Clara looked at Maggie. The girl was still on the floor, and the dog was still in her lap, and the scarf was still in her hand. Neither of them seemed interested in moving. "Can someone bring her a blanket?" Clara asked. "And some water. For both of them." Briggs nodded and went to find both, and Clara stood there in the dim corridor with her borrowed handkerchief and her aching shoulders and her bandaged-together heart, watching a little girl and a golden retriever breathe together on a stone floor, and she thought about her mother's kitchen and the old rescue dogs and the midnight sessions on the linoleum, and she wondered if Ruth could see this. Wherever she was, whatever came after, Clara wondered if her mother knew that the letter had worked, that the words had carried her daughter all the way here, to this corridor, to this moment, to this strange and broken and beautiful proof that walking into rooms where nobody wants you is sometimes the only thing that matters. The veterinary officer arrived 11 minutes later. He was a short man with kind eyes and careful hands, and he examined the dog right there on the corridor floor because Maggie would not let go of him and no one had the heart to ask her to. Both back legs were badly bruised but not broken. Some swelling around the left hip. Minor cuts on his paws. Nothing that rest and time and love wouldn't fix. "He's a tough one," the vet said, scratching the dog behind his ears. "What's his name?" Maggie looked up. "Captain," she said, and then, as if it needed explaining, she added, "He was my mum's dog first, before he was mine." The vet smiled at her. "Well, Captain is going to be just fine. He needs to rest and stay off those legs for a few days. But he's going to be okay." Maggie looked at Clara. "Did you hear that?" she said. "He's going to be okay." Clara nodded. "I heard," she said, and her voice came out rougher than she meant it to, because the relief was hitting her now, really hitting, the way waves hit after a storm when the wind has died down but the water hasn't gotten the message yet. Chaplain Beckett arrived minutes later, out of breath and still in his nightclothes with a coat thrown over the top. He was a thin man in his 60s with white hair and glasses and the kind of face that looked like it had been designed specifically for worrying. He scooped Maggie up with one arm and kept the other on Captain's collar, and he looked at Clara with an expression that contained so many things. Gratitude, shock, exhaustion, fear that hadn't fully left yet, that his face couldn't settle on any single one of them. "Thank you," he said. "Just that. Thank you." But he said it the way people say it when the words aren't big enough for what they mean. When thank you is standing in for, "You saved the only thing my granddaughter has left and I will never forget this as long as I live." Clara nodded again because nodding was all she could manage right now, and Beckett carried Maggie away down the corridor with Captain limping beside them, and Clara watched them go until they turned the corner and disappeared and the corridor was empty and quiet and still. She stood there alone for a long time after that. Just stood there, in the dust and the dim light, looking at the sealed passage where 3 seconds had separated everything from nothing, and she felt the night settle around her like a coat. Her mother's coat. Too big and too warm and exactly what she needed. Then she walked back to her quarters, sat down on her bunk, and stayed very still for a very long time. The pain came later. Not the emotional kind. She had already felt that and was still feeling it and would probably keep feeling it for days. The physical kind. Her shoulders ached so deeply she couldn't lift her arms above her chest. Her hands, now that the adrenaline was gone, burned with every heartbeat as the torn skin announced itself in sharp, persistent waves. Her back, scraped raw by stone during the crawl, stuck to her undershirt with dried blood, and when she tried to peel the fabric away, the pain was so sudden and so bright that she had to stop and breathe through her teeth and wait for it to pass. She sat on the edge of her bunk in her small room and stared at the opposite wall and tried to make sense of the last 2 hours. But sense wasn't the right word. None of it made sense. Sense was what the world was supposed to make when things followed rules and procedures and proper channels. Tonight had followed nothing except the sound of a dog crying and a child saying please, and something deep inside Clara that had stopped asking permission. A knock came at her door. Soft, almost hesitant. "Come in," Clara said, and her voice sounded like it belonged to someone who had been talking for days without stopping. The door opened, and Captain Aldridge stood there holding 2 cups of tea. He was still in his scarlet uniform, but his collar was unbuttoned at the top and his hair was slightly out of place, and he looked like a man who had been sitting somewhere alone for a while, thinking about something that wouldn't leave him alone. "I thought you might need this," he said, holding out one of the cups. Clara took it. The cup was warm against her torn palms, and the warmth traveled up through her hands and into her wrists and settled somewhere in the center of her chest. And she was surprised by how much difference a warm cup could make when everything else was cold. Aldridge pulled the single wooden chair from beneath the small desk in the corner and sat down across from her. He held his own cup with both hands and looked at the floor for a moment before speaking. "My father was in the military," he said. "Career officer. 32 years of service." Clara looked at him. He hadn't spoken to her before tonight. Not really. The occasional nod in the corridor. A brief morning when their shifts overlapped. Nothing more. He was the youngest officer on the command, and he carried himself with the careful quietness of a man who knew he was surrounded by people who had been doing this longer than he had been alive. "What happened to him?" Clara asked, because she could hear in his voice that something had. Aldridge took a sip of his tea, set it down on the desk, picked it up again. The small, restless movements of someone deciding how much to say. "He was dismissed," Aldridge said. "Unfairly. He questioned a senior officer's decision during an exercise, and the officer used it as grounds for removal. Said my father was insubordinate. Filed the paperwork. Had him out within a week." He paused. "I was 8 years old. I didn't understand what had happened. I just knew that my father, who had been the strongest, most certain person in my world, came home one afternoon and sat down at the kitchen table and didn't get up for 3 days." Clara said nothing. She just listened, because sometimes listening is the most important thing you can do for someone, and she could tell that Aldridge had been carrying this for a long time and didn't take it out often. "It broke him," Aldridge said quietly. "Not all at once. Slowly. Over years. He never went back to work. He never appealed the decision. He just accepted it, and the acceptance ate him from the inside. He died when I was 19. Heart attack. But honestly, I think he died the day they sent him home. Everything after that was just the rest of him catching up." He looked at Clara directly for the first time. "When I watched you stand up in that chamber tonight and speak to Hargrove, I saw something I've been waiting to see for 25 years. Someone doing what my father never got the chance to do." His voice was steady, but his eyes were not. "You didn't wait for their permission. You didn't accept their judgment. You stood up and you walked out and you proved them wrong in a way that none of them could deny or explain away or bury in paperwork." He picked up his tea and held it without drinking. "I stepped aside when you walked past me because I knew you were right," he said. "And because I needed to see what happens when someone like you doesn't give up. I needed to know that it was possible, that the system doesn't always win." Clara looked down at her hands. The bandages Briggs had wrapped around them were already soaked through in places, and beneath the white cloth, her fingers throbbed with a steady, patient pain that she knew would be with her for days. "I was terrified," she said. Aldridge looked at her. "Inside the passage," she continued, "when the space got tight and I couldn't move, I was so scared I couldn't breathe. I thought I was going to die in there. But you kept going. Because I could hear him. The dog. I could hear him breathing. And I kept thinking about that little girl upstairs, sitting on the floor in her mother's coat, asking someone to please not leave him. And I thought, if I stop now, if I go back, she will be sitting on that floor tomorrow and the next day and the day after that, and every single day she will know that someone was close enough to help and didn't." She looked at Aldridge. "I couldn't be that person. I couldn't go back into that chamber and sit there while she lost the only thing she had left. Because I've been her. I know what that feels like. And I know what it feels like when no one comes." The room was quiet for a while after that. Just 2 people sitting with their tea and their wounds and their histories, and the strange, fragile understanding that sometimes grows between people who recognize each other's pain. "Your father," Clara said after a while. "What was his name?" "James," Aldridge said. "James Aldridge." "He would have been proud of you tonight," Clara said, "for stepping aside." Aldridge's mouth did something complicated that was almost a smile but not quite. and he looked away, and Clara saw him blink several times in quick succession, and she knew what that meant because she had done it herself enough times to recognize it in someone else. "I hope so," he said quietly. He finished his tea and stood up and placed the cup neatly on the desk and buttoned his collar and straightened his uniform, and when he turned back to Clara, the careful, professional composure was back in place, but underneath it, something had shifted between them. Not romance, not attraction, something deeper and simpler than that. The recognition of shared damage. The understanding that they were both, in their own ways, trying to live up to people who were gone. "Get some rest, Corporal," he said. "You've earned it. Good night, Captain." He paused at the door. "Aldridge," he said. "When it's just us, it's Aldridge." Then he left, and Clara sat on her bunk in the quiet room and held the warm cup against her chest and closed her eyes and thought about her mother's letter. She reached under her pillow and took it out. The paper was so soft now, so worn from being folded and unfolded hundreds of times, that it felt more like cloth than paper. She opened it carefully, the way you open something that might fall apart if you're not gentle. "My sweet girl, you were made for something bigger than this small life I gave you. Don't be afraid of rooms full of people who don't believe in you. Walk in anyway." She had read these words so many times that she could see them with her eyes closed. But tonight they felt different. Tonight, for the first time since her mother died, the words didn't make her feel sad. They didn't make her feel lonely or lost or afraid. They made her feel found, like she had been walking through room after room after room for 4 years, following instructions she didn't fully understand, and tonight she had finally walked into the right one. She folded the letter and put it back under her pillow and lay down and pressed her face into the thin military pillow and breathed in and smelled nothing but clean laundry and dust. And that was okay, because the person she needed to smell wasn't in a pillow or a scarf or a cardigan anymore. She was somewhere else. Somewhere closer. Clara slept for 11 hours straight. No dreams. No waking. Just deep, still, heavy sleep. The kind that comes after your body and your heart have been emptied out completely, and there is nothing left to do but let them fill back up again. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. Life rarely changes with fireworks and grand announcements. It changes the way weather changes slowly and then all at once, and when you look back, you can't quite point to the moment when the sky became different. The formal complaints against Clara disappeared. Not withdrawn officially, not acknowledged, not discussed. They simply stopped existing, as if the men who had filed them had collectively decided that whatever principle they had been defending wasn't worth defending anymore. Whether Hargrove had spoken to them privately, Clara never knew. She never asked. Some things are better left unexamined, and this was one of them. Officers who had looked through her for 14 months began looking at her. Not with warmth, not right away, but with something that was at least in the same neighborhood. A nod in the corridor from Major Davies, who had never once acknowledged her existence. A "good morning, Corporal" from Lieutenant Harris, who had previously treated her presence like a mild inconvenience. Small things. But small things are how walls come down. Not in one great crash, but one brick at a time, quietly, until one day you realize you can see through to the other side. Mercer was the hardest to read. He didn't soften the way the others did. He didn't nod or smile or make small talk, but he started assigning Clara more responsibility. First it was small, overseeing a supply inventory, reviewing a security rotation. Then it grew. A week after the collapse, he asked her to accompany a senior team on a perimeter inspection. 2 weeks after that, he put her in charge of the night shift rotation for the entire East Wing. He never explained why. He never referenced the night of the collapse or the dismissal hearing or the corridor. He just handed her the assignments and walked away, and Clara understood that this was Mercer's version of an apology. He would never say the words. He would probably go to his grave without saying them. But he would show her, in the only language he knew, that he had been wrong and he knew it. Clara visited Maggie for the first time on a gray afternoon 2 weeks after the collapse. She had a day off, the first real one in months, and she could have spent it sleeping or reading or doing any of the 100 small things that pile up when you spend your life working shifts that no one else wants. Instead, she put on civilian clothes and walked across the grounds to the chaplain's residence. A small stone cottage with ivy climbing the walls and a wooden door painted green that was slightly too short for its frame. Chaplain Beckett opened the door before she knocked. "She's been asking about you," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "Every day. She calls you the lady who went in the dark. I don't think she knows your name." "Clara," she said, and offered her hand. He shook it gently, carefully, as if he was afraid of hurting her bandaged palms. "James Beckett. But most people just call me Chaplain." "Is she here?" "In the garden. With Captain." "Where else?" He smiled when he said it, but the smile had a sadness underneath it that Clara recognized because she carried the same kind herself. The sadness of people who love someone who is hurting and can't fix it and have learned to live alongside the pain instead of trying to make it go away. The garden behind the cottage was small and neat, with a low stone wall around the edges and a wooden bench in the center and flower beds that had been carefully tended by someone who found peace in growing things. Maggie was sitting on the grass near the bench with her legs crossed and her two big green coats spread out around her like a blanket, and Captain was lying beside her with his head on her knee, his golden fur clean and bright in the pale afternoon light. When Captain saw Clara, his whole body changed. His head came up. His tail started moving. Not the weak single thump from the dark passage, but a full, sweeping wag that made his entire back end sway from side to side. He pulled himself up on his bruised legs and limped toward her across the grass, and Clara knelt down and caught him, and he pushed his face into her neck and breathed against her skin, and she felt his tail beating against her arm, and she pressed her forehead against his warm skull and closed her eyes and let herself feel it. The weight of an animal who remembered, who knew, who hadn't forgotten that she was the one who came. "He does that," Maggie said from behind them. Clara looked up and saw the girl watching her with a serious, steady expression that seemed far too old for a 6-year-old face. "He always knows when someone is good. Mummy said dogs can see things people can't. She said they see the inside of you, not the outside." Clara sat down on the grass beside Maggie, and Captain settled between them, his head on Clara's leg, his tail on Maggie's knee, as if he was making sure both of them knew he was there and wasn't going anywhere. "Your mum sounds like she was very smart," Clara said. "She was." Maggie pulled the pale blue scarf from her coat pocket. She had been carrying it with her, and Clara could see that the fabric was clean now, washed since the collapse, but more faded than before, as if the dust and stone had taken something from it that couldn't be put back. "The scarf doesn't smell like her anymore," Maggie said, and her voice was matter-of-fact in the way that children's voices sometimes are when they're saying something devastating without knowing it. "It used to smell like her perfume, like flowers and soap, but now it just smells like dust." Clara felt her chest tighten. She knew that loss. She knew exactly what it felt like when the last trace of someone disappears, when the pillowcase is finally washed, when the cardigan is worn too many times, when the letter is folded and unfolded so often that it stops smelling like the hand that wrote it. She knew the panic that comes with that moment, the desperate, helpless feeling of losing someone all over again in the smallest possible way. "But Captain remembers," Maggie said, and she touched the dog's ear gently. "Every night before he goes to sleep, he puts his nose on the scarf and he breathes in really slowly, like he's looking for something. And I think he finds it, because he always closes his eyes after, like he's happy." She looked at Clara with those serious, too-old eyes. "Dogs know things we don't," she said. "Mummy told me that. She said Captain would always remember her, even when I couldn't, because dogs don't forget people they love. They keep them inside, in a place that doesn't wash out." Clara looked at this girl, this small, dust-streaked, motherless girl in her dead mother's coat, and she saw something that she hadn't expected to see. She saw strength. Not the loud, obvious kind that generals wear on their chests in the form of medals and gold braiding. The quiet kind. The kind that grows in children who lose things too early and learn to carry the weight without being taught how. The kind that Ruth Ashford had carried every day of her life, cleaning other people's houses and rescuing other people's dogs and raising a daughter alone on a salary that never quite covered everything, and never once complaining about any of it because she was too busy loving the world to resent it for being hard. "Maggie," Clara said, "can I tell you something about my mum?" The girl nodded. "She rescued dogs too, just like your mum loved Captain. My mum's house was always full of dogs that nobody else wanted. Old ones, sick ones, scared ones. She used to sit with them on the kitchen floor in the middle of the night, just holding them, telling them they were safe. Did she die too? Maggie asked. The question was so direct, so completely without cushioning or hesitation, that Clara almost smiled, because children ask the questions that adults spend their whole lives trying to find polite ways around. Yes, Clara said. 4 years ago. Do you still miss her? Every day. Maggie was quiet for a moment. She stroked Captain's ear slowly, rhythmically, the way you stroke something when your hands need something to do while your mind is working through something big. I miss my mum most at bedtime, Maggie said, because she used to sit on my bed and tell me a story, and then she'd tuck the covers around me really tight, like a cocoon, and she'd say, "You're wrapped up in my love now, so nothing bad can get in." And I'd feel so safe. And now nobody does that. Clara's eyes burned. She blinked hard and looked at the sky and breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth. And beside her, Captain lifted his head and looked at her face and then gently, very gently, licked her hand, as if he understood that she needed steadying and this was the only way he knew how to provide it. Captain does something, though, Maggie continued. He sleeps on my feet. Every night. Right on top of them. And when I wake up from a bad dream, I can feel him there, and it's warm, and I think maybe that's his way of doing what Mommy used to do. His way of saying nothing bad can get in. Clara reached out and touched Maggie's hand. Just lightly. Just enough for the girl to feel it. I think your mum and my mum would have been friends, Clara said. Maggie considered this seriously, the way she seemed to consider everything. Then she nodded. I think so too, she said, because they both loved the ones nobody else wanted. They sat there in the garden for a long time after that, the three of them, with the pale afternoon light falling through the clouds and Captain sleeping between them with his nose resting on the blue scarf that Maggie had spread across his paws. And Clara felt something she hadn't felt in 4 years. Not happiness exactly. Not the sharp, bright happiness of a good day or a funny joke. Something deeper and slower and warmer. The feeling of being connected to another person by a thread that goes through the middle of everything. Through loss and grief and love and hope, and all the way back to a kitchen floor where a woman in a small flat once sat with her arms around a shaking dog and whispered, "You're home now. Have you ever met someone who understood your pain without you having to explain it? Someone who just knew because they carried the same kind of weight? I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if this story is touching your heart the way it's touching mine, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Now, let me tell you what happened next. 3 weeks after the collapse, General Hargrove summoned Clara to his office. Not the council chamber, with its long table and its scarlet officers and its cold formality. His personal office. A smaller room, warmer, with a wooden desk covered in files and a leather chair that had been sat in so many times it had molded itself to the shape of one particular body. There was a window with heavy curtains half drawn, letting in a strip of gray afternoon light, and on the wall behind the desk, a single framed photograph. Clara stood at attention in front of the desk, and Hargrove waved his hand dismissively. "Sit down, Corporal. This isn't a review." She sat. The chair across from his desk was stiff and straight-backed, the kind designed to remind you that you were in the presence of someone important. But Hargrove himself didn't look important right now. He looked tired. Not the commanding, purposeful tiredness of a man who works hard. The deep, settled tiredness of a man who carries something he's never put down. He was looking at the photograph on the wall behind him. Clara followed his gaze. The photo was old, slightly faded, and it showed a much younger Hargrove, maybe 30, in a military uniform she didn't recognize, kneeling beside a German shepherd. The dog was large and alert, sitting upright with its ears forward and its tongue out, and young Hargrove had one arm around its neck and a grin on his face that Clara had never seen on the man who sat before her now. A real grin, unguarded, the kind of smile that only exists when you're with something you love and you don't know yet that you're going to lose it. "His name was Archer," Hargrove said, still looking at the photograph. "Working dog. Military. Best dog I ever knew. Smarter than half the officers I served with and more loyal than all of them combined." He turned back to Clara. His face was controlled, the way it always was, but his eyes had that same wet quality she had seen in the corridor 3 weeks ago. Not crying. Just full. 40 years ago, I was a young lieutenant on a training exercise in the North Country. Rough terrain. Cold. The kind of cold that gets into your joints and stays. Archer was with me, as always. We were running a patrol simulation when the ground gave way beneath him. Old mining tunnel, collapsed years before, covered over with soil and grass. He went through, fell maybe 15 feet into the shaft. I could hear him down there, barking. And I could tell from the sound that he was hurt. Hargrove paused. He picked up a pen from his desk and turned it over in his fingers, the way people do when their hands need something to hold while their mouth says things their body doesn't want to let out. I started to go after him, started clearing the debris from the opening. My commanding officer saw what I was doing and ordered me to stop. Said we were behind schedule. Said it was a dog. Said the exercise took priority. He set the pen down. And I obeyed, he said. I followed the order. I left Archer in that shaft and continued the exercise. Took us 4 more hours to complete. By the time I went back, the shaft had collapsed further. It took the recovery team another 2 hours to reach him. His voice was steady. His face was steady. But Clara could see the cost of that steadiness in the way his hands lay flat on the desk, pressing down, as if the wood beneath them was the only thing holding him to the surface of himself. He died alone, Hargrove said. In the dark. In a hole in the ground, 15 feet from where I was standing when my commanding officer told me to walk away. And I walked away, because that's what you do when you follow orders. You walk away, and you carry it. The room was very quiet. I have carried that for 40 years, Hargrove said. Every day. Every single day. I see his face when I close my eyes at night. I hear him barking in that shaft. And I wonder what would have happened if I had disobeyed the order. If I had said no. If I had gone after him anyway. He looked at Clara, and in his eyes she saw something she had never expected to see in a general's face. Not authority. Not certainty. Not the armored confidence of a man who has spent 4 decades being right. She saw guilt. Old, deep, permanent guilt. The kind that doesn't fade or soften or heal. The kind that just becomes part of you, like a scar that forms on the inside where nobody can see it but you feel it every time you move. When I gave the order to seal that corridor, Hargrove said, I was making the same mistake my commanding officer made. The same mistake I have regretted every day for 4 decades. I was choosing protocol over a life. I was choosing safety over doing what was right. And I was passing the same guilt forward to the next generation. He stood up slowly. He walked to the photograph on the wall and stood in front of it. And Clara watched him reach out and touch the glass over the German shepherd's face with one finger. A small, private gesture that said more than any speech. You didn't follow the order, Hargrove said, his back still to Clara. You did what I should have done 40 years ago. You said no. You went in. And you brought him out. He turned around. I'm not telling you this because I want your sympathy, Corporal. I'm telling you because I want you to understand what happened in that corridor. It wasn't just about a dog or a little girl or a collapsed passage. It was about me watching a 23-year-old corporal do the thing I failed to do when I was her age. And realizing that the person we were about to dismiss was the only person in the building who had the courage I lost 40 years ago. Clara sat very still. She didn't know what to say, and she sensed that Hargrove didn't need her to say anything. He needed someone to hear it, to know, to carry part of the weight, not because she owed him anything but because some burdens are too heavy for one person and the only thing that makes them lighter is admitting they exist. There's something else, Hargrove said, sitting back down. His voice changed now, became more measured, more official, as if the personal part was over and the general was stepping back into the room. Your dismissal wasn't entirely about your scores or your field hours. There was pressure. From above. Certain officials who were uncomfortable with your presence in the guard and saw the clerical error as a convenient excuse to remove you. I received communications recommending your quiet removal. And I went along with it because it was easier. He held her gaze. I went along with it because it was easier, he repeated. I want you to hear me say that. I want you to know that I know it. And I want you to know that it will not happen again. Not to you. Not to anyone under my command. I have written to every official involved and informed them that your position is permanent, that your record is clean, and that any further attempts to remove you will be met with my personal and public opposition. Clara's throat was tight. She swallowed. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me, Hargrove said. I should have done it 14 months ago. I should have done it the day you walked through the gate. But I didn't, because I was too comfortable being the kind of man who follows orders and sits behind a desk and lets other people do the hard things. He paused. You showed me what I used to be, before I started following orders that I knew were wrong. He opened a drawer in his desk and took out a small wooden box. He set it on the desk between them and opened the lid. Inside, on a bed of dark velvet, was a medal. Small. Simple. A bronze circle on a dark ribbon. Not nearly as ornate as the clusters of gold and silver that decorated the general's uniforms. This is the Guard's commendation for exceptional conduct under extraordinary circumstances, Hargrove said. It hasn't been awarded in 11 years. I'm recommending you for it personally. Clara looked at the medal. It was small enough to fit in the palm of her hand. It weighed almost nothing, and it meant almost everything. Sir, I didn't do it for a medal. I know, Hargrove said. That's exactly why you deserve one. The medal ceremony happened the following week, in the same council chamber where Clara had stood waiting to be dismissed. The same long table, the same stone walls, the same dim light falling from above. But everything else was different because this time when Clara walked into the room, every person in it turned to look at her, and this time they saw her. Hargrove pinned the medal to her uniform himself. His hands, those rough old leather hands that had held a pen over her dismissal papers, were gentle and precise, and when the pin was fastened and the medal hung against her chest, he stepped back and nodded once, and Clara nodded back, and the room was quiet in that full, weighted way that rooms are quiet when something important has just happened and everyone knows it. Mercer shook her hand afterward. He didn't smile. He didn't say much. Just well done, Corporal, and a handshake that was firm and brief and somehow, in its stiffness, completely sincere. Because Mercer would never be warm. That wasn't who he was. But he could be fair, and tonight he was being fair, and for a man like Mercer that was as close to an apology as the world would ever get. Aldridge caught her eye across the room and raised his teacup slightly. A private toast that no one else noticed, and Clara raised hers back, and they both drank, and the thread between them held steady. The quiet understanding of two people who had recognized something in each other in the middle of the worst night of their lives and had decided, without ever discussing it, that it was worth keeping. 3 months after the collapse, Clara received a small package in the mail. There was no return address. The handwriting on the envelope was large and careful and slightly uneven, the way letters look when they've been written by a small hand that is still learning how much pressure to put on the pencil. Inside was a photograph. Maggie sitting on a garden bench, sunshine falling across her face. The green coat replaced by a yellow jumper, as if somewhere in the last 3 months, she had started reaching for her own clothes instead of her mother's. Captain was asleep across her lap, his golden fur bright and clean, and around his neck, tied loosely like a bandana, was the pale blue scarf. Maggie was smiling. Not a big smile, not the kind you put on for a camera, but a real one, a quiet one, the kind of smile that takes a very long time to come back after it's been gone. And when it does come back, it comes back different, softer, more careful, more aware of what it costs to lose it. On the back of the photograph, in that same careful, uneven handwriting, were 2 lines. His name is Captain. He still sleeps on my feet. Thank you for going in the dark to get him. Clara read it 4 times. She pinned it above her desk with a single thumbtack and sat down in her chair and pressed both hands against her face and cried. Not the desperate, choking tears of the corridor. Not the silent, swallowed tears of the dismissal hearing. These were different. These were the tears that come when something inside you that has been broken for a long time begins, very slowly, to mend. When the crack doesn't disappear but starts to fill with something new. Not what was there before, but something that fits, something that holds, something that is strong enough to carry weight again. She kept that photograph for 26 years. Through every promotion, every transfer, every late night and early morning and long shift and hard decision. It went with her to every office, every posting, every new assignment. pinned above her desk, always in the same spot, always the first thing she looked at when she sat down in the morning and the last thing she saw before she turned off the light. And she rose. Slowly, steadily, the way she did everything. Not by making noise or demanding attention or fighting battles that didn't need fighting. Just by being good at what she did and never forgetting why she did it. Corporal became sergeant. Sergeant became lieutenant. Lieutenant became captain, and then major, and then something that no one had ever imagined possible when she first walked through the gate as a clerical error in a navy blue tunic. Clara Ashford became the highest-ranking woman in the history of the Royal Guard. And whenever someone new joined the unit and saw the photograph above her desk, they always asked about it. Who was the girl? Who was the dog? Why was there a scarf tied around his neck like a bandana? And Clara would lean back in her chair and look at the picture, and her face would do something that was hard to describe. Not exactly a smile, not exactly sadness, but something in between that held both at once. "I was supposed to be sent home that night," she would say. "They had the papers ready. My name was already on the line. I was nobody to them. A mistake on paper that needed to be corrected." She would touch the edge of the photograph, where Captain's golden fur caught the garden light. But a dog who wouldn't let go of a dead woman's scarf taught a room full of generals what loyalty actually looks like. And a little girl who had already lost everything reminded me why my mother told me to walk into rooms where nobody wanted me. She would pause. And in that pause, the room would always go still, because people can feel it when someone is about to say something true. Really true. The kind of true that doesn't need decoration or explanation or emphasis. The kind that just lands. "You don't have to be wanted to belong somewhere," she would say. "You just have to be willing to go into the dark when it matters." And somewhere across the city, an old golden retriever with a gray muzzle and stiff hips still slept on Maggie Beckett's feet every single night, and a faded blue scarf still rested on the nightstand beside them, worn so thin you could see light through the fabric. And every night, before he closed his eyes, Captain would lift his nose toward that scarf and breathe in, long and slow, searching for something in the threads that he had never stopped finding. And Maggie, who was not 6 anymore but 23, the same age Clara had been on the night that changed everything, would rest her hand on his old gray head and whisper the same thing she had whispered every night for 17 years. "She's still here, boy. She's still here." And Captain would sigh, a deep, long, contented sigh, the kind that comes from an animal who has spent his whole life being exactly where he belongs, doing exactly what he was meant to do, guarding the heart of a girl who lost her mother too soon, keeping her feet warm in the dark, carrying the scent of someone they both loved in a place that doesn't wash out. He would close his eyes, and Maggie would pull the covers up and turn off the light. And in the darkness of a small room, in the quiet of a world that kept turning despite everything it took, an old dog and a young woman and a faded blue scarf would rest together the way they always had. And neither of them were ever alone again. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this story. If you enjoyed this story, I promise you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more thrilling as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.